What if the greatest invasion in the history of the galaxy is not an empire, not a crusade, and not even a war in the way humans understand it, but a hunger so vast that entire star systems vanish inside it like sparks in a storm? Tonight, we are going to settle into one of the most feared forces in all of Warhammer 40,000, the Tyranids. We will look at what they are, how they think, why they are so terrifying, and how 3 of their most infamous hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, carved their names into Imperial history. And if you are listening to this to wind down, that works perfectly, because Tyranid lore has a strange rhythm to it. It begins with panic and extinction, but the deeper you go, the more it becomes a story about instinct, adaptation, and a cold, cosmic kind of inevitability. The Tyranids are one of the purest expressions of existential dread in Warhammer 40,000. They do not negotiate. They do not conquer worlds in order to rule them. They do not collect tribute, spread a faith, or build a lasting civilization in the normal sense. They arrive, they strip a planet of every useful resource, and they move on. Forests, oceans, atmosphere, animal life, human life, metals, minerals, even the microbes in the soil can be harvested. The result is not occupation. The result is absence. A consumed world is not usually left broken in the way an Imperial war zone is broken. It is left hollowed out, cleaned, reduced to bare ruin. That simple fact is why the Tyranids feel different from almost every other major faction in the setting. Chaos wants a corruption, worship, and eternal conflict. The Imperium wants survival and control. The Orcs want battle. The Eldari want to outlast extinction. The Necrons want restoration, domination, or silence, depending on the dynasty. But the Tyranids want biomass. They want energy. They want raw matter that can be rendered down and remade into more Tyranids. Their wars are feeding events. Their invasions are acts of digestion on a planetary scale. And yet that description, while true, is still too simple. Because the Tyranids are not just mindless animals. They are a superorganism of unimaginable complexity. Every gaunt, every warrior, every monstrous bioform, every hive ship, every spore, every feeder tendril, and every adaptive mutation is part of one greater intelligence, often described as the Hive Mind. If individual Tyranids can seem feral up close, the whole species is anything but. It learns, it reacts, it plans in a way that is alien, ruthless, and often difficult for Imperial commanders to predict. That is one of the most important things to understand from the start. When the Imperium speaks about the Tyranids, it often does so through military categories: vanguard organisms, synapse creatures, bioships, hive fleets, splinter fleets, gene stealer infestation, planetary consumption. Those terms are useful, but they can also make the Tyranids sound like a conventional enemy force with a command structure and logistical chain. They are not. They are closer to an ecosystem compressed into a weapon. Or perhaps more accurately, they are a galaxy-spanning predator whose organs can be spread across thousands of light years and still act in concert. To understand the Tyranids properly, it helps to begin not with a battle, but with a question. Where did they come from? And the honest answer, even in canon, is that no one within the galaxy truly knows. The Tyranids are generally understood to have come from beyond the galactic rim, from the dark between galaxies. That alone is enough to make them terrifying. The Milky Way in Warhammer 40,000 is already crowded with horrors. Ancient star gods, daemonic powers, dying empires, psychic catastrophes, crusading human armies, living machines, greenskin invasions. And beyond all of that, outside the known map, there was apparently something even worse. A devouring extragalactic swarm, vast enough to send multiple hive fleets into. Galaxy, and still leave open the nightmare possibility that these are only the first tendrils. That possibility hangs over almost every Tyranid story. Are Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan the main body of the species? Are they scouting waves? Are they separate assaults from a total presence still gathering in the void? Imperial scholars, Magi biologists, inquisitors, and military authorities have debated that in fragments for centuries. But the mood of the lore is clear. The known Hive Fleets are not reassuring evidence that the threat has been measured. They are evidence that the threat may barely have begun. Before we get to the 3 great Hive Fleets named in our title, we need to understand how a Tyranid invasion works at the most basic level. Because once you know the cycle, every story about them becomes more chilling. A Tyranid assault rarely begins with giant bioships appearing in orbit without warning. Often, the first stage is infiltration. Gene stealers are among the most infamous Tyranid organisms for exactly this reason. These are fast, deadly alien creatures that can seed an infestation long before a true invasion arrives. Through infection and reproduction, gene stealers can create hybrid bloodlines inside human or other populations, leading over generations to the rise of a gene stealer cult. These cults are one of the great internal dangers of the Imperium, because they can remain hidden for years, even decades, buried inside underhives, mining colonies, manufactorums, void stations, and frontier settlements. They preach liberation, transformation, belonging, and often a kind of ecstatic reunion with starborn saviors. To the victims, the coming of the Tyranids is imagined as ascension. In reality, it is consumption. That is one of the cruelest details in all Tyranid lore. The gene stealer cult often works to destabilize a world from within. It sabotages communications, weakens defenses, incites uprisings, and prepares the population psychologically and materially for invasion. Then, when the Hive Fleet finally arrives, the cult discovers too late that there is no place for it in the feast. The Tyranids do not reward loyalty, they absorb it. Alongside infiltration comes another sign of Tyranid approach, the shadow in the warp. This is the psychic effect generated by the presence of the Hive Mind and the vast concentration of Tyranid consciousness. To psychers and sensitive minds, it can feel like suffocation, static, pressure, dread, or total spiritual smothering. Astropathic communication becomes difficult or impossible. Warp travel becomes more dangerous. Command structures reliant on long-range psychic contact begin to fracture. Panic grows, coordination collapses. In a galaxy where interstellar civilization depends heavily on the warp, despite all its dangers, the shadow in the warp is a strategic nightmare. The Tyranids do not merely invade space, they muffle the very medium through which empires speak. Then comes the fleet itself. Tyranid hive ships are not ships in the human sense. They are living organisms. They travel through the void as biological entities, supported by an array of symbiotic and weaponized forms. Some carry spores, some unleash boarding organisms, some are built for massive ranged bombardment using bioplasma, living torpedoes, and other forms of bioweaponry. Some are part of the digestive machinery of conquest. The distinction between transport, warship, factory, breeding chamber, and command vessel becomes blurred because Tyranid biology unifies these functions. What a forge world might need a vast industrial civilization to build, the Tyranids grow. When a target system is reached, the swarm begins to isolate and strip it. Space superiority matters enormously. If orbital defenses are strong, the battle can be catastrophic and prolonged. If they fail, the planet below is in dreadful trouble. Mycetic spores rain from the skies. Bioinforms descend in endless waves. May later rise from the world's surface, connecting planet to orbit so that the harvested biomass can be pumped upward into the waiting fleet. Atmospheres can be altered, water drained, living matter dissolved in acid reclamation pools. The dead are not only casualties, they are resources. This process is one reason Tyranid warfare is often described as economical in a horrific biological sense. A lost gaunt is not merely expended. If the swarm wins, that biomass returns to the greater pool. The Tyranids can trade lives aggressively because their dead can become future generations. They are not wasteful in the human emotional sense, but they are efficient beyond anything human generals can match. Their armies can appear infinite because they are constantly being broken down and reconstituted in accordance with need. At the center of their battlefield function lies synapse. This is another essential concept. Many Tyranid organisms, especially the smaller ones, are guided and stabilized by synapse creatures, such as hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, zoanthropes, and other key bioforms. These creatures act as nodal points of the hive mind's will. Within synapse range, lesser Tyranids become coordinated, fearless, and lethally effective. Outside it, some may fall back on instinctive behavior, becoming more animalistic, less flexible, or driven by preset patterns such as feeding, hunting, or raging attack. This does not mean that the Tyranids can simply be defeated by killing synapse creatures, but it does mean that Imperial tacticians quickly learn to prioritize them. The problem, of course, is that the hive mind also learned. It learned to protect synapse organisms, to saturate battlefields with them, and to evolve new combinations. And this brings us to perhaps the defining strength of the Tyranid species: adaptation. Tyranids are not static. They absorb genetic material, evaluate battlefield conditions, and produce new bioforms or altered strains to answer resistance. A world with heavy armor may see more anti-tank organisms. A fortress line may be met with tunneling horrors, artillery beasts, flying swarms, or psychic monstrosities. An enemy that relies on one weapon type may find later waves bearing thicker carapaces, different metabolism, changed movement patterns, or entirely new solutions. The Tyranids do not just overwhelm, they study through violence. This adaptive quality is why every major hive fleet feels like both part of the same species and a distinct strategic personality. Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan are not separate civilizations with separate politics, but each became known for different modes of assault, different patterns of movement, and different theaters of devastation. In Imperial records, these distinctions matter because commanders need categories. To the hive mind itself, they may simply be useful expressions of one appetite. Before the first great named invasions shook the Imperium, there were already signs that the galaxy was dealing with something new and uniquely dangerous. Isolated attacks, mysterious disappearances, dead worlds, and bizarre xenos organisms hinted at an enemy not yet understood. But the event that truly announced the Tyranids as a galactic-scale threat was the arrival of Hive Fleet Behemoth. Behemoth is remembered as the first major Tyranid hive fleet encountered by the Imperium in full force, and first impressions matter. The name itself communicates scale. This was not a hidden infestation or a limited raid. This was the moment the Imperium saw the Devourer and understood, perhaps for the first time, that an alien force could threaten entire sectors, not through conquest, but through total biological erasure. Behemoth entered the eastern regions of the galaxy and struck with tremendous power. What made it especially frightening was its directness. Behemoth did not seem subtle. It hit like a battering ram. Worlds in its path were consumed, and the Imperium had to confront not just the tactical challenge of defending planets, but the strategic realization that every consumed world strengthened the enemy. Delay favored the swarm if delay allowed feeding. Attrition favored the swarm if attrition merely provided more matter. One of the key early horrors associated with Behemoth was the destruction of Tyran, the world from which the Tyranids took the common imperial name by which they are known. That naming is important in the way human naming often is. It reflects a familiar pattern in the Imperium. Humanity encounters something ancient, alien, and incomprehensible, then labels it based on the first disaster that forces recognition. The species did not call itself Tyranid. Humanity named it after loss. As Behemoth advanced, the Imperium struggled to grasp its true nature. Even then, there were efforts to study and classify. The Adeptus Mechanicus sought biological understanding. The Inquisition watched for wider implications. Planetary governors worried about evacuation and defense. The Astra Militarum prepared mass resistance. The Space Marines, as so often in 40k lore, were called upon to do the impossible with inadequate time. The most famous confrontation of Behemoth's campaign was the battle for Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines. If you know anything about Tyranid history, you know this battle matters. It is not simply a set piece. It is one of the defining wars in the relationship between the Imperium and the Great Devourer. Macragge was no weak frontier colony. It was the capital world of Ultramar, a realm disciplined, fortified, and watched over by one of the most renowned Space Marine chapters in Imperial history. If Behemoth could break itself on Macragge, perhaps the Imperium could hope. If Macragge fell, the psychological effect would be enormous. The battle unfolded in brutal stages. Tyranid forces hit the system and engaged in void war, where their bioships clashed with Imperial naval assets and the defenses of the Ultramarines. Even victory in space brought little comfort, because enough organisms made planetfall to trigger savage ground battles, including the famous defense of the polar fortresses. These frozen bastions became symbols of stubborn resistance against impossible numbers. What makes Macragge so memorable is not that the Tyranids were effortlessly defeated. Quite the opposite. The Ultramarines and their allies paid dearly. First Company veterans were heavily depleted in the fighting. Defensive lines were overrun, restored, and overrun again. Tyranid waves threw gaunts, monstrous creatures, and synapse leaders into the meat grinder until the defenders were on the edge of annihilation. The conflict showed exactly what made the Tyranids different from conventional enemies. They did not tire. They did not become demoralized. They did not seek terms. Every moment of survival had to be purchased through killing efficiency on a near-superhuman scale. In the end, Behemoth was broken at Macragge, but that phrase can mislead if it sounds too clean. The Imperium won a vital defensive victory. It did not solve the Tyranid problem. It learned the cost of surviving it. Behemoth's destruction or dispersal proved that a Hive fleet could be stopped under the right circumstances, with overwhelming effort, sacrifice, and fortunate concentration of force. But it also proved that such victories would never come cheaply. Macragge became a lesson in Tyranid warfare. Fortification helped, but static defense alone could be buried. Elite troops mattered enormously, but even the Space Marines could be drowned by attritional pressure. Synapse targeting was useful, but not always enough. Orbital control was critical. Above all, the Imperium learned that underestimating the scale of the swarm was fatal. Every data point from Behemoth suggested not a strange Xenos nuisance, but an existential military phenomenon. So viewers drifting into the slower rhythm of this story, to pause and notice something subtle. Behemoth's legacy is not just destruction, it is revelation. The Imperium had seen countless horrors before, but Behemoth introduced a new model of fear. Not the fear of corruption, not the fear of rebellion, not even the fear of superior technology in the way Necron awakenings might inspire. This was the fear of being reduced to food by a force too large to hate in human terms. And yet, after Behemoth, there may have been a temptation to think the worst had been met and answered. The Imperium had identified the enemy. It had survived the great test. Procedures could be improved. Defenses could be prepared. Commanders could study Macragge and learn. But the Tyranids were not done teaching, and the next great lesson came in the form of Hive Fleet Kraken. If Behemoth was the hammer, Kraken was the knife. Where Behemoth was associated with massive direct assault, Kraken became notorious for speed, dispersal, and multi-pronged predation. This is one reason Tyranid lore stays so compelling. Each major Hive fleet reveals that there is no single perfect anti-Tyranid doctrine, because the enemy itself does not commit to one way of war. Kraken entered the galaxy in a pattern that deeply alarmed Imperial strategists. Rather than presenting one concentrated front that could, at least in theory, be met by consolidated resistance, Kraken spread into many tendrils and splinter forces. It moved through a broad region, attacking across multiple vectors. This made prediction and defense profoundly difficult. Worlds could not be sure whether they were on the edge of the threat, at its center, or about to face a splinter assault from a direction command had barely considered. This style of advance exposed a major weakness in Imperial structure. The Imperium is enormous, but that does not mean it is nimble. It is bureaucratic, fractured, slow to relay accurate information, often suspicious of local reports, and frequently forced to prioritize one crisis over 10 others. A hive fleet that behaves like a broad, branching predator can exploit all of that. Relief forces arrive late, sector command misjudges the main target, astropathic distress dies under the shadow in the warp, admirals defend the wrong lane, governors hoard supplies, isolated worlds disappear one by one. Kraken's campaign also intersected with some of the most famous Tyranid conflicts in the setting, including its battles with the Eldari and the Imperium, and particularly